I'm here today with Lisa K. Swallow. Lisa is the co-founder and executive director of Crossing Party Lines, a national nonprofit that creates open dialogue between Americans with dissimilar ideologies in order to increase tolerance, build communities, and encourage civic engagement. She's an advisor for America Talks and a member of the Alliance for Peacebuilding. She has developed a series of workshops teaching the concepts, skills, and techniques for having civil, respectful conversations with people who view the world differently, and currently offers coaching and training for difficult conversations. She's also authored dozens of articles and posts, multiple papers in the field of communication, and holds a patent in microlithography. Her artwork is in the permanent collection at the Smithsonian Institute, and her short stories have appeared in multiple anthologies. And if that's not enough, she is also the author of two books that we'd like to talk about. The first is titled, Yes, You Can Talk Politics, a workbook for talking across party lines. And the second book is No One Was Listening. So you can learn more about Lisa at lisakswallow.com. So Lisa, my goodness, congratulations on all you've accomplished. And thanks so much for joining us and for doing all the work that you do.
Thank you. And thanks for having me here.
So before we talk about the books, I've got to, ask you about your background. Lithography, Smithsonian. Can you talk a little bit about a few different aspects of things you've done?
Sure. So I'm one of those people who loves to learn. If there's any topic, I want to learn about it. I'm actually better and more happy when I am learning than when I become an expert at something. So give me something new and I'll dive into it. So I've been excited about learning how computers work, how we design them, down to the bit and byte level. I've been excited to learn about how people connect with one another. So I got trained in nonviolent communication and neurolinguistic programming. So anything and everything just really excites me. And then when around 2016, we started having some real challenges talking to one another, I saw that as something I could dive into. I could try to figure out what was going on and bring all of my years of research and understanding difficult problems to this particular one.
Well, thank goodness for that, because this is certainly one of the most intractable areas I've ever seen. And I worked in high tech, as we talked about too, quite a bit, and had some pretty serious problems that we tried to solve there. But this is tougher, quite frankly, than something that's math and science oriented. But let's get into Crossing Party Lines. Talk, if you could, about how that organization started and what the nature of it is today.
Yeah. Well, I started it because I had been doing my research into why is it so difficult to connect. And specifically, I'd started with my cousin. He and I grew up together. He was in Southern California. I was in Northern California, but we would spend much of our summers together. So when we were adults and we started talking politics and I discovered that his views were about as far from mine as you could get, I was really taken aback and got curious and tried to figure out why that was. So I had just retired from high tech and I had some time on my hands. So I decided to start researching this. And I started with an assumption, which was, oh, it's just the media. He watches Fox News and I listen to PBS. And I decided that that's where we would start, but I learned it wasn't the media. And so then I started to explore it from lots of different angles and discovered that humans are not built to all be the same, which was, that's obvious, but we don't think about that very often. We tend to think that, well, if someone has all the same facts I do, they're going to see the issues the same way I do. Well, it turns out that's not really true, and there's lots of reasons for that. But then I discovered that knowing how we're different, why we're different, still didn't help us talk. And I started looking more into the psychological aspects of it. What does it mean to be heard? How do we really listen? And that drove me into looking about what is active listening? And then how do we stay focused when we're talking to someone whose views are different than our own and we want to argue rather than listen? How can we keep ourselves in check and truly do the listening? So about September of 2016, I had figured out a way that worked with my cousin And I wanted to see if it would work with other people. So I started a meetup in Portland, and it was Crossing Party Lines, just to see who's interested and would they be willing to try what I developed, and I could test it out on them. Turned out there's a lot of interest, and it did work, and people helped me evolve my process, and we co-created what Crossing Party Lines is today. Meanwhile, a gentleman in New York City had the idea of getting people together to talk about differences. And he also started a meetup group called Crossing Party Lines. So we got together, discovered that we had a very common vision, and we joined forces and created a nonprofit and started expanding into other cities and states around the country. So now we're in 9 states. We're planning to expand. I will say the pandemic kind of took us on a detour, and we become all virtual, and now we're having to get back to the local and in-person meetings, and that's a bit of a lift for us. But yeah, we've got 10 different chapters. We have weekly conversations where people from all around the country and sometimes around the world come and join us to have these conversations. And the process is expanded into now 7 different workshops on different aspects of talking about differences.
Wow.
And our focus has always been on individuals, helping people learn to talk with one another and build community and sustain relationships despite differences in political views. We're not focused on politicians or making a difference in the political arena so much as empowering people to have a voice and learn how to make that voice heard.
Well, I think it's such incredibly important work, given the polarization and the other difficulties, in our country. You mentioned conversations and you mentioned workshops. Those are 2 different things, I assume, correct?
They are, yeah.
And so how do they work? I mean, just pick an online version if you want to, or what have you.
So what I've learned is talking with someone whose views are different than us takes some specific skills. But not everyone wants to take classes in this. Not everyone buys into that at first. So my interpretation is you think in terms of the horse and the cart. The horse are the skills that are pulling us along. The cart is the important stuff, understanding the issues, exploring those issues from lots of different angles. And some people want to start with the cart. They say, hey, I just want to come and I want to talk to someone. I've got no one in my life that I can talk to that has a different view than my own. So I really want those conversations. So we offer those. And when people come to a conversation, they start to learn that we talk politics differently than they're used to. We don't invite them to debate. We invite them to listen. We invite them to share why their views make sense to them. And it becomes a really different experience for them. So they start learning the skills organically, the way we learn to walk or the way we learn to speak a new language. And it takes a while for them to learn that way. But then they start getting curious about, well, if I really wanted to get serious on this active listening stuff, or I want to get better at presenting my views, I don't feel like I do a good enough job, then they take the workshops where I teach them how to do that, and then they can focus in it. So I think in terms of skills need to be practiced to be mastered. So we offer the skills, we offer the opportunity to practice, and those conversations are both that practice place and the entry point, and also a place that a lot of people come to really understand the issues of the day, because they're real topics that we're talking about, current events and big issues.
Well, as part of our How to Heal Our Divides effort, I've been looking for organizations like yours, and I wish I would have, learned about yours earlier. But there are a couple of others that are somewhat similar in nature that have been part of either our first or our second books. One is called 3 Practices, and the other one is called Braver Angels. And I wondered if you could, this is not a competition, in any stretch of the imagination, but I'd love for you to just, just talk about how Crossing Party Lines is unique.
Sure. Now, I don't know about 3 practices, and once we're off this call, I'm going to look them up. It sounds interesting. I do know about Braver Angels. A lot of our volunteers work for both Braver Angels and us. They do a fabulous job exposing people to the possibility of talking across differences, get people curious about other people's views, things like that. They have a few skills trainings, but their focus is more on big events. You know, we'll teach you how to fish and then set you free and hope you have actually mastered it. From my personal experience, I found that a class doesn't teach you how to fish. You know, it might teach you where the fishing pole is and where to put the bait, but in order to learn how to fish, you need some practice, and you need to get comfortable reading the water, and you need to know that the time of day matters, right? Fishing takes practice and developing the skills towards mastery. So I think of Braver Angels as pointing people on the right path for coming to us, so that we can not only hone those skills, take them from that high level introduction that Braver Angels teaches in their classes, bring them down to specific actionable steps, and then give them an opportunity to practice and hone those skills.
Interesting. Well, that's very helpful for me to understand, kind of the different areas of focus that you all have. So let's get into the books. The first one, as I mentioned, is called Yes, You Can Talk Politics, a workbook for talking across party lines. What motivated you to come out with that book?
Well, every time I would do the workshop, people will say, "Hey, can I have a PDF of your slides?" And on the one hand, I wanted to say yes, but I knew that the slides were only half of the learning experience. So much of the experience also comes from the questions that people ask, hearing the real-time answers, adding nuance to the slides. So I wanted to be able to hand them something, and I put together the workbook. It follows the workshops, but it has a lot of activities and extra information to fill in those things that would come organically when folks are asking questions and sharing their problems with the new skills. And, so when you're talking to people about listening, one of the things that often comes up is, well, I'm tired of listening. I want them to listen to me. So then I would talk to them about why listening is so important and so powerful. And that wasn't in the slides. So I had to find a way to put that in the workbook. So it's standalone. You don't need to have other people asking questions for you.
So the book is 325 pages long, right? Which is more than I typically expect in a workbook. So this sounds like it's got some depth to it, not just, superficial.
It does. It also has a lot of activities. It's got almost 100 activities. And I also did big font, because when you're in a workbook, you don't want to strain your eyes. You want all your energy going to the thought processes. So I like to think about it as more like 180 pages with activities.
Okay.
But this is not an easy problem. So when you simplify it down to, oh, I'm just going to teach you active listening or this or that, it doesn't really empower you to do the work. You need to understand, what are you going to bump into that's going to cause problems? So the workbook was initially the basic skills. So there are 5 workshops I consider basic. But then I realized that when you're teaching those, people run into things like prejudice and bias and judgments around the other person. And I needed to write something to help them. If you're learning these skills and you bump into these, there's a lot more you need to start exploring in terms of looking at yourself and your attitude. So I had to tack on a couple more sections to it to explore those things.
Wow. Interesting. So one of the things that you make clear in the book is that this is not about debate. And so can you talk a little bit about why that's the focus you're avoiding, so to speak, or moving away from?
Yeah, well, the thing about debate is it assumes that everything's all logical and reasonable. So if I can share with you everything that I know, then you're going to agree with me. I'm going to just be able to prove that my position is logically the right one. The assumption is that if you knew what I knew, you'd agree with me. So I'm just going to keep giving you more of those facts, and you're going to eventually agree with me. But that's not really true. So one thing we know is no one can know exactly what you do. if they get all the facts you give them, it's still not all the facts that you have. They also have their own facts. We also know that people interpret facts differently. We don't always use the same logic. We're not always solving the same problem, and we're not even trying to address the needs of the same group of people. So the idea of debate is, it's really nice in an academic setting, but it doesn't get us to where we understand one another and start solving our problems collaboratively.
And so, I mean, obviously this is a very, very difficult area. Is there a way that you've been able to measure results of your work?
We don't have a great measurement tool. What we do is we've often done surveys, pre and post surveys, where we find out, did people feel like they learned something? Are they looking at the issue from a more nuanced perspective? Did they make friends with people who they would have thought they had nothing in common with before? So it's really more qualitative metrics that we have. And I'm not sure that there's any way to do it differently right now,
Yeah, I don't
honestly.
either. I don't have any suggestions. But, it's just, we all feel like these are things that we need to do. But
Yeah.
then, you still have to ask yourself, well, is it making a difference? Right? I mean, and I feel confident that that's the case, but I don't know
Yeah, well, you have to ask yourself, what does it mean to make a difference? So if we're looking at that global scale, does my looking at things from multiple angles change who gets elected? Probably not. But let's get down to that granular level. On a personal level, one of the most common things people report to me is they feel safer, less anxious, more comfortable in the world today because they know the folks on the other side are not necessarily bad guys. They recognize that, oh, wow, they're humans like I am. They're concerned about America. They care about where we're going as a country. So now I feel more safe. We also see that relationships start to heal. So on a personal level and interpersonal level, it's obviously making a difference. And most of our members believe that this can become something that grows and builds. So we start with a few people knowing how to talk to one another, and then more people, and then more people. And eventually it will impact what happens on that local or state or federal level in terms of voting. Not yet, but eventually it will. They also feel that it helps them to look more with more of an open mind at how we run our government. So one of the things that comes up a lot is people in our organization often say that they're not really pleased with the two-party system. And they've been curious about, why do we have a two-party system in the first place? It is not built into the Constitution. And so we've looked at how do we vote? How do we count our votes? And so a number of our people have started looking into how to get things like ranked choice voting enacted so that we have more parties representing more people. And we as an organization aren't standing behind anything. We are apolitical. But we see there's a trend that our members are trying to not just be more informed voters, but have a say in how we count the vote and how we are represented.
Well, I agree with you that this whole thing has to be a grassroots, effort. It starts with the individuals, right? And,
Yeah.
and clearly the results that you described have had an impact, I think, in decreasing polarization, right? Which, as we were kind of talking at the beginning, is one of the symptoms, the visible, aspects of this intractable problem. So congratulations on that. So let's get into the second book. That one's much different than the first. It's called No One Was Listening. What led you to write that one?
Oh, I started out, I come from high tech. I'm pretty logical and reasonable, I think. But what I discovered when I went into this project, there was a lot of emotionality. I had to do a lot of personal growth. I had to confront my fears. I basically went on a journey, a really challenging journey. And as I was going through it and watching how all of my friends reacted to it, I saw that people were afraid to step into this, afraid to learn to talk across differences because so many things would come up for them. And I wanted to be able to present my journey so that they could know they could take that journey too.
Hmm.
I also wanted to say, look, it's not going to be easy. Here's all the challenges I faced, personal, interpersonal, you name it. It was scary. But I came out at the other end feeling stronger and more alive and more participatory. So I wanted to say, take the journey. Yeah, it's a little scary, but here's proof that it can be done. So that's why I decided to give that memoir aspect to it.
Wow. Wow. Well, can you share a little bit about what some of the most difficult aspects of that journey were like?
Yeah, I think the most difficult for me was realizing I wasn't who I thought I was.
Wow.
So yeah, when I started this, I just assumed, I'm a good communicator. I've made my living through communication, and I'm a loving partner, and I'm a good critical thinker. What I discovered was that in personal life, in political conversations, so outside of the corporate world, I tended to be operating on autopilot. And that meant that I wasn't really listening. I wasn't really seeing my partner as someone different from me who had different needs and concerns. And I wasn't even looking at politics rationally. I was absorbing what was coming in around me, and that was what I based my views on. So when I discovered that here, all these things I thought I was good at, I wasn't, I felt a lot of emotional distress. Some of it was shame, a lot of self-judgment, even some grief that of all these years that I'd missed opportunities to connect and be with on this deeper level. So that was hard. There were times I kind of wanted to give up, but I realized I couldn't unlearn that I wasn't who I thought I was. And I did not want to be that person anymore.
Wow.
So I kept going.
What a transformation.
Oh yeah, it's changed my life so much.
Huh. Goodness. So looking forward, I mean, are there any additional books that you're thinking about?
Yeah, the one I'm excited to write about, I'm calling it in my mind, it's called The Logic of Politics, but on the cover, in front of logic is one of these things that point you up and says the illogic of politics. And what I want to do is I want to go through the historical records and look at a lot of the political slogans and speeches and things like that from about 100 years ago and look for what kinds of false equivalents do they use. So I'm looking at logical fallacies. I'm looking at biases that in reporting and in presenting information. And then I want to say, this was happening 100 years ago. And then I want to dive into what's happening today. And here's examples of those same, let's call them mental shortcuts that we use to keep us from being logical and critical thinkers. It's happening today. And so giving them names, giving them examples, I think will help people recognize when reporting is biased or when they're buying into something like a slippery slope logic. There's a little bit of that in the workbook where I say, it's faulty logic if, it's good logic if that. But I want to go a lot deeper into that and empower people to just approach politics with a more critical eye.
Wow. That sounds excellent. Please keep us posted on that.
I will.
And then what about for crossing party lines? What are the next parts of that agenda?
We are embarking on a new project which has to do with how to bring more more conservatives, especially in rural parts of America, into the conversations. They have been overlooked for a long time. From all of my interactions with folks in the rural areas, they are feeling not just misrepresented or underrepresented, they're also feeling as though no one truly wants to listen to them. So they're feeling somewhat hopeless. So we are trying to figure out how to bring more of those folks into the conversations, and we're doing it in a very scientific way. So we're going to be doing a lot of analysis. We'll be doing multiple pilot programs that we can see how is it different in Montana from rural California, from Eastern Oregon or Kansas, right? So what is it that will encourage people to want to join this conversation and empower them to be part of the Crossing Party Lines community.
Interesting. So having myself participated in the communications technology business most of my life and seeing a couple of different incarnations of video phones, for instance, back in the 60s, and another incarnation in the 90s, and now finally having something like what we're using right now, right? Zoom. Do you think that this technology will help bridge the gap between the geography barriers that we have? As you mentioned, there's just a lot of rural parts of the country that physically are quite far apart, from California or New York or whatever. Can this help?
Yes, definitely. So one thing we know about folks in the rural areas, they've got cell phones, they've got computers, they can take advantage of this technology. The challenge is more how do we reach them and convince them that they want to use their time, which is precious. If you're running a farm, you are not doing a 9-to-5 job. You are working from sun up to sundown. So how do we get them to want to invest the time and the energy and take that scary step of being vulnerable to use the technology that we've got? So our focus is more on connecting with the people. And so it's more like marketing. But in those rural communities, they are not as susceptible to the internet marketing or using social media. There's still a lot that happens on the ground, in the local feed store, in the bar, or at church. So we need to connect with them on that non-low tech level. And then they have the technology. They just, then they'll want to use it and connect with others. We also see the need for them to stay local. They tend to be more local focused. So we want to empower them to be working on the local issues together and dealing with the differences there. There might not be as many differences in political parties. Who knows? Every town is different. But there's certainly discussions around, is this good for us or that? And how do we deal with water rights or wolves or whatever that might be? So we want them to empower them to have those local conversations, but we also want to pair them up with more liberal urban, assuming the rural and conservative go hand in hand, which I don't really like to make that assumption, but we'll pair them up with another chapter that they can then use the technology to build relationships with and explore the other issues with someone whose views are even more different than the ones in their chapter.
Well, as a person that does a lot of online marketing, there's a certain segment of the country or segment of the population that a lot of marketing people call unreachable.
Yeah.
Right? Is what you're describing. How then, how do you actually reach them?
Right. And we're trying to figure that out. And we'll be working with churches. We'll be getting some people on the ground to say, how do you identify who are the influencers in this particular town? And it's not going to be the same every time, but we do hope to see some patterns. And once we identify those patterns, we want to create a playbook for all bridging organizations to say, start here, try this, 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 and this. I think it's, like any grassroots effort, I think once we gain traction, it's going to start coming more easily. But it does start with knowing who you're working with and how do they learn from one another and connect with one another.
Wow. Well, good for you. Difficult work, but you're really attacking it, I think, incredibly smartly. So
thank you.
I'm very, very glad to hear that. So as I mentioned, the titles of the two books are Yes, You Can Talk Politics, a workbook for talking across party lines, and the memoir is No One Was Listening. So Lisa, again, thank you so much for all of this amazing work. And you can learn more about Lisa's work at lisakswallow.com. Lisa, thanks so much for joining us.
Brian, thank you. Thanks for doing the podcast. Thank you for the books. We're all in this together, and I like having you on our side.
Yeah, well, thank you so much.